Get your filthy hands off my table, you worthless piece of trash! Victoria Ashworth Sterling's voice explodes across the marble floors of Le Bernardin as she towers over Gabrielle Washington, a black waitress who had simply been clearing the neighboring table. The pharmaceutical heiress's diamond bracelet catches the light as she gestures dismissively. "Ma'am, I was just—" Gabrielle begins quietly. "Don't you dare speak back to me!" Victoria's palm strikes Gabrielle's face with a crack that silences the entire restaurant. "You people are all the same, lazy, stupid, and completely beneath me." The room holds its breath. Wealthy diners shift uncomfortably in their seats, but no one moves to intervene. This is their world, where money talks and everyone else stays silent. But what none of them knew was that the woman they were watching get humiliated held more power than anyone in that room could imagine. Have you ever seen someone completely misjudge who they were dealing with? 20 minutes earlier, the evening had begun like any other at Le Bernardin. The Michelin three-star restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of Manhattan's elite, their voices mixing with the soft clink of crystal and silver. At table 12, Gabrielle Washington moved with practiced grace, her movements precise and economical as she served the most demanding clientele in New York City. But Gabrielle wasn't just any waitress. Behind her professional smile lay years of training that had nothing to do with hospitality. Her eyes, sharp and observant, swept the dining room with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to cataloging details others would miss. The expensive Omega watch on her wrist, a graduation gift she'd told her colleagues, caught the ambient lighting as she poured wine with steady hands. "The usual table for Miss Ashworth Sterling," the maitre d' had whispered earlier, gesturing toward the prime corner booth. "She's requested you specifically again, Gabrielle. 3rd time this month." Victoria Ashworth Sterling, 45 years old, worth an estimated $800 million, and heir to one of America's largest pharmaceutical empires. Ashworth Sterling Pharmaceuticals had dominated headlines recently, not for their innovations, but for their aggressive pricing strategies that had sent life-saving medications soaring beyond the reach of ordinary Americans. As Gabrielle approached the table, she caught fragments of conversation from nearby booths. The restaurant had become an unofficial meeting ground for the pharmaceutical industry's power players, their voices low but not quite low enough for someone with trained ears. "FDA approval should be locked in by December," came a whisper from table 8. "The offshore accounts are clean. Cayman Islands, as discussed," drifted from table 15. Gabrielle's hand moved to her phone, a seemingly casual gesture as she appeared to check the time. In reality, the device had been recording conversations for the past 18 months, each snippet carefully cataloged and transmitted to a secure server downtown. The Justice Department's Financial Crimes Division had been building their case methodically, one dinner conversation at a time. Victoria swept into the restaurant at exactly 8:15, her entrance choreographed for maximum impact. The Hermes handbag, the Louboutin heels clicking against marble, the way other diners turned to acknowledge her presence, everything calculated to reinforce her position at the top of New York's social hierarchy. "Water, still not sparkling, and make sure the glass is actually clean this time," Victoria commanded without looking up from her phone. Her tone carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned their right to treat others as inferior. Gabrielle nodded politely. "Of course, Miss Ashworth Sterling. The chef has prepared a special tasting menu this evening." "I'll decide what I want when I decide I want it," Victoria cut her off. "Just bring the water and try not to contaminate it with your presence." The insult hung in the air, but Gabrielle's expression never changed. She had endured worse over the past year and a half. Every slight, every degrading comment, every moment of humiliation had been carefully documented and would soon serve a purpose Victoria could never imagine. As Gabrielle moved toward the kitchen, she passed table 9, where 2 pharmaceutical executives were deep in conversation about eliminating competition and price coordination across markets. Her phone captured every word. These weren't just wealthy people enjoying expensive dinners. They were the architects of a system that prioritized profits over human lives. The other servers at Le Bernardin had learned to avoid Victoria's table. "She's impossible," whispered James, a veteran waiter with 15 years of experience. "Last month, she made Sarah cry in front of the entire dining room. Management won't do anything because she spends too much money here." But management's willingness to enable Victoria's behavior served Gabrielle's purposes perfectly. The more comfortable Victoria felt, the more freely she spoke about business matters she assumed were safe from scrutiny. After all, who would suspect that the black waitress she regularly humiliated was actually a federal agent with the authority to bring down her entire empire? Tonight felt different, though. Victoria's phone calls had been more urgent, her meetings more secretive. Something big was happening in the pharmaceutical world, something that couldn't wait for the usual monthly gathering. As Gabrielle returned with the water, she noticed Victoria texting frantically, her face flushed with what looked like barely contained excitement. Finally, Victoria muttered to herself, then looked up at Gabrielle with unconcealed disdain. I'm expecting guests tonight. Important guests. Try not to embarrass yourself when they arrive. Gabrielle simply nodded, but her pulse quickened. After 18 months of patient work, tonight might finally be the night when everything comes together. What she didn't know was that Victoria was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The evening's carefully orchestrated facade began to crumble at exactly 9:47 p.m. Gabrielle had just served the amuse-bouche when Victoria's voice cut through the restaurant's refined atmosphere like a blade. This is completely unacceptable. I specifically requested the lobster to be prepared without any cream-based sauce, and this, she gestured dismissively at the delicate portion, this is drowning in some peasant preparation. I apologize, Miss Ashworth Sterling, Gabrielle replied calmly. I can have the kitchen prepare a new dish exactly to your specifications. It will take approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes? Victoria's voice rose, drawing glances from neighboring tables. Do you have any idea who I am? I don't wait for anyone, especially not for some incompetent kitchen staff who can't follow simple instructions. The transformation in Victoria's demeanor was swift and ugly. The polished socialite veneer cracked, revealing something far more sinister underneath. Her perfectly manicured fingers drummed impatiently against the white tablecloth as her eyes narrowed with barely contained rage. Ma'am, I understand your frustration, Gabrielle began, maintaining her professional composure despite the growing hostility radiating from across the table. Let me personally ensure the kitchen prioritizes your order. You understand. Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. You understand nothing. People like you never understand anything beyond the most basic, menial tasks. The fact that you even think you're qualified to speak to me is laughable. The phrase, people like you, hung in the air like a poison cloud. Every person in the restaurant understood exactly what Victoria meant. The coded racism was unmistakable, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for their bigotry. At table 7, an elderly couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman reached for her husband's hand, whispering urgently about whether they should intervene. At table 15, a group of pharmaceutical executives, Victoria's own business associates, shifted uneasily in their seats, suddenly finding their wine glasses fascinating to study. Perhaps we could discuss this more quietly, Gabrielle suggested, her voice still steady but with an undertone that suggested she was far from defenseless. Quietly? Victoria stood abruptly, her Hermes chair scraping against the marble floor with a harsh screech that made several patrons flinch. I'm not the one who needs to be quiet here. You need to listen, and you need to learn your place in the natural order of things. The restaurant's usual gentle murmur had died completely. Even the sommelier, who had been making his rounds with a vintage Burgundy, froze mid-pour as Victoria's voice echoed off the high ceilings. Natural order? Gabrielle's eyebrow arched slightly, a subtle sign that Victoria was venturing into dangerous territory. Yes, the natural order, Victoria continued, her voice growing louder and more venomous with each word. Some people are born to lead, to create, to build empires that employ thousands and generate billions in value, and others, she gestured dismissively at Gabrielle, others are born to serve, to clean up after their betters, to know their place and stay in it. The racist implications were now impossible to ignore. Several diners pulled out their phones, some recording discreetly, others more openly documenting what was rapidly becoming a career-ending moment for Victoria, though she was too consumed with her own sense of superiority to notice. The problem with your generation, Victoria continued, pacing now like a predator circling prey, is that you've been told you're special, that you deserve things you haven't earned. But reality is different. Reality is that some people matter and some people don't. Gabrielle remained perfectly still, but those who knew what to look for might have noticed the subtle way her posture had shifted. Her weight balanced, her hands relaxed but ready. Her expensive watch caught the light as her pulse remained steady, the calm of someone who had faced real danger before, not the manufactured crisis of a spoiled heiress throwing a tantrum. "Do you know what my family's company did last quarter?" Victoria demanded, her voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the restaurant. $2.8 billion in revenue. Do you know what that means? It means we're essential. It means we matter. It means when I speak, people with actual power listen. She leaned closer to Gabrielle, her breath smelling of the expensive wine she'd been consuming since arrival. You, on the other hand, are completely replaceable. There are 1,000 other girls just like you who would kill for this job. Girls who understand that when someone like me gives them an order, they say, "Yes, ma'am," and they do it with a smile. The maitre d' approached hesitantly, his face pale with anxiety. "Miss Ashworth Sterling, perhaps we could—" "Stay out of this, Francois," Victoria snapped without taking her eyes off Gabrielle. "This is between me and the help, though I'm beginning to wonder if she even understands English properly. Maybe I need to speak more slowly?" She turned back to Gabrielle and began speaking in an exaggerated, condescending tone, her voice dripping with mock patience. "Can you understand me? Do you need me to explain this more simply? Or should I get someone to translate into whatever language you people actually speak at home?" The racial undertones had become overtones, impossible to misinterpret or excuse. At table 12, a prominent Manhattan judge quietly asked for his check, unwilling to remain in the same room as Victoria's display. At table 3, a young couple recorded everything on their phones, already composing the social media posts that would make this moment viral within hours. But Gabrielle's response was not what Victoria expected. "I understand you perfectly, Miss Ashworth Sterling," Gabrielle said, her voice steady and clear, with just a hint of something that might have been amusing. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately?" The suggestion seemed to infuriate Victoria even more. Her face flushed red, whether from wine or rage was impossible to tell. "Privately. I don't have private conversations with the help. You'll stand here and listen to what I have to say, and you'll remember exactly where you belong in this world." Victoria stepped closer, invading Gabrielle's personal space in a way that felt both threatening and deliberately humiliating. The scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the alcohol on her breath as she leaned in, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that somehow carried to the nearby tables. "You people are all the same," she hissed. "Lazy, entitled, and completely unable to meet even the most basic standards of competence. You think the world owes you something just for existing. But the truth is, you're nothing. You contribute nothing. You matter to no one who actually counts." The verbal assault was designed to be devastating, to break down Gabrielle's dignity piece by piece in front of the city's elite. Victoria wanted witnesses to this humiliation, wanted everyone to see what happened when someone forgot their place in her carefully ordered universe. "You could learn something about work ethic from people who built their success through merit instead of government handouts and diversity quotas," Victoria continued, her voice rising again. "But I suppose that would require actual intelligence, which seems to be in short supply around here." At this point, several diners had stopped even pretending to ignore the confrontation. The scandal was too large, too public to pretend it wasn't happening. Phones were recording from multiple angles, capturing every word of what would soon become evidence in ways Victoria couldn't imagine. "Maybe if you spent less time playing on your phone and more time actually working—" Victoria reached out suddenly and slapped the device from Gabrielle's hand, sending it clattering across the marble floor. "You might actually be worth the minimum wage they waste on you." The phone skittered under a nearby table, its screen still glowing, recording still active, capturing every word of what would become Exhibit A in a federal case. But Victoria wasn't finished with her performance. "You people are all the same, lazy and incompetent," she declared, her voice now loud enough to carry to the kitchen staff, who had stopped their work to listen to the commotion. and then her hand connected with Gabrielle's cheek in a sharp slap that echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before the first phone began to ring. Gabrielle stood perfectly still, her hand moving slowly to touch the red mark spreading across her cheek. But instead of tears or anger, something else flickered in her eyes, something that should have terrified Victoria if she had been smart enough to recognize it. "Security cameras captured all of that, I assume?" Gabrielle asked quietly, her voice carrying clearly an absolute silence. Francois, the maitre d', nodded wordlessly, his face pale with shock. In 15 years of managing Le Bernardin, he had never witnessed anything like this. "Yes, ma'am. Multiple angles." "Good," Gabrielle said, her tone suddenly different, more controlled, more authoritative. "I'll need copies of that footage." Victoria laughed, a harsh sound that seemed obscene in the restaurant's refined atmosphere. "Your footage? For what? To show your manager before I have you fired? Let me save you the trouble." She turned to Francois. "This person is no longer welcome in your establishment. I trust that won't be a problem?" But Francois was staring at Gabrielle with growing confusion. Something about her demeanor had shifted completely. The deferential service worker was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Ma'am," Francois said carefully, "I think perhaps we should call the police. This was assault. In front of witnesses." "The police?" Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "For disciplining an insubordinate employee. Don't be ridiculous. I know half the police commissioners in this city. They work for people like me, not people like her." As if summoned by her words, 2 NYPD officers appeared at the restaurant's entrance. Someone had already called 911, and in Manhattan's Upper East Side, response times were measured in minutes, not hours. Officer Martinez approached the table first, his partner Officer Carter hanging back to observe. "We received reports of an altercation. Can someone explain what happened here?" Victoria immediately stepped forward, her posture radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed without question. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This employee became belligerent when I made a simple request about my meal. She was rude, confrontational, and frankly threatening. I may have raised my voice, but only to defend myself." Officer Martinez looked skeptical. The red mark on Gabrielle's face was clearly visible, and the tension in the room suggested something far more serious had occurred. "And you are? Victoria Ashworth Sterling. My family owns Ashworth Sterling Pharmaceuticals. Perhaps you've heard of us?" The name-dropping was automatic, designed to establish her credibility and importance. "I have dinner here regularly. Francois can confirm my character." But when Martinez looked to Francois for confirmation, the maitre d' hesitated. "There was more to it than that, officers. Much more." "He's clearly been intimidated," Victoria said quickly. "These people stick together, you know how it is. But I have witnesses." She gestured to the other diners, many of whom suddenly found their plates fascinating to study. Officer Carter had moved to Gabrielle's side. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Gabrielle replied calmly. "But I would like to file a formal complaint for assault. I have witnesses, and I believe the incident was recorded on multiple devices. Indeed, at least 6 diners had their phones out, though most were now trying to discreetly pocket them. The viral potential of the footage was obvious to everyone present. "This is outrageous," Victoria declared. "Officers, I contribute significantly to the Policemen's Benevolent Association. I'm personal friends with Commissioner Williams. One phone call from me—" "Ma'am," Officer Martinez interrupted, his tone professional but firm. "Threatening to use political connections to influence a police investigation is not advisable. We need to establish the facts here." Within minutes, the restaurant had been transformed into an active crime scene. Other diners were asked to provide contact information as potential witnesses. The security footage was secured. Statements were taken from staff members who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Victoria's confidence began to waver as she realized the situation was not unfolding according to her expectations. The officers were treating this as a legitimate investigation, not the minor inconvenience she had assumed it would be. "This is absurd," she protested, as Officer Carter began taking detailed photographs of Gabrielle's injuries. "You're wasting taxpayer money on a trivial dispute between an employer and an employee." "Actually, ma'am," Officer Martinez corrected, "this appears to be assault in the third degree, a misdemeanor but still a criminal offense. We'll need you to come to the station to provide a formal statement." The words criminal offense seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow. For the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flickered across her face. But what she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The woman she had just assaulted was about to reveal an identity that would transform this simple assault case into something far more serious, something that would bring down everything Victoria had ever built. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the interview room where Victoria sat, her confidence finally beginning to crack. Officer Martinez had just finished reading her rights when Gabrielle was escorted into an adjacent room for her own statement. "This is completely unnecessary," Victoria muttered, checking her diamond-encrusted Cartier watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "My attorney should be here any moment, and when he arrives, you'll understand exactly who you're dealing with." Through the one-way glass, she could see Gabrielle sitting calmly in the next room, speaking quietly with Officer Carter. The sight of her alleged victim appearing so composed only fueled Victoria's irritation. "She's probably spinning some sob story about oppression and victimhood," Victoria said to Martinez. "These people always do. They can't take responsibility for their own failures, so they blame everyone else." But something was happening in the other room that Victoria couldn't quite see. Gabrielle had reached into her purse, not for tissues or identification as Victoria might have expected, but for something else entirely. Officer Carter's expression changed dramatically as Gabrielle placed a leather wallet on the table and opened it slowly. His eyes widened, and he immediately straightened in his chair, his entire demeanor shifting from casual interview to formal respect. "Ma'am," Carter said, his voice suddenly different, "I had no idea. Why didn't you identify yourself earlier?" Through the speakers that connected the two rooms, Victoria heard Gabrielle's response clearly. "Special Agent Gabrielle Washington, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division, badge number 7429. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the implications crashed over her in waves. The waitress she had humiliated, assaulted, and threatened was a federal agent. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered. But even as she spoke, she could see Carter speaking urgently into his radio, requesting immediate supervisory presence. Within minutes, the small police station was transformed. FBI agents began arriving, their black SUVs filling the parking lot. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, took over the case personally. "Miss Ashworth Sterling," Rodriguez said as she entered the interview room, "I think we need to have a very different conversation now." But Victoria was still reeling from the revelation. She's lying. She has to be lying. Why would an FBI agent be working as a waitress? "Because," came a new voice from the doorway, "Agent Washington has been conducting an 18-month undercover operation investigating financial crimes in the pharmaceutical industry." Assistant Director James Morrison stepped into the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. Behind him, Agent Washington entered, no longer dressed as a waitress, but in a crisp business suit that transformed her entire appearance. "Good evening, Miss Ashworth Sterling," Gabrielle said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible to reconcile with the woman Victoria had been humiliating just hours earlier. "We need to talk." Victoria's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. The woman standing before her bore little resemblance to the submissive service worker she thought she had been tormenting. This was clearly someone accustomed to command, to respect, to being taken seriously by the most powerful people in the country. "You see," Morrison continued, settling into a chair across from Victoria, Le Bernardin has served as an unofficial meeting place for pharmaceutical executives for the better part of 2 years. Agent Washington has been documenting conversations, recording transactions, and gathering evidence of what we believe to be the largest price-fixing conspiracy in American history. The room seemed to spin around Victoria. Every dinner, every casual conversation about business, every assumption of privacy had been an illusion. The federal government had been watching, listening, recording everything. "The charges against you for tonight's assault are just the beginning," Agent Washington said, opening a thick folder filled with documents. "We have recorded conversations of you personally approving price increases on life-saving medications. We have evidence of coordination with competitors to eliminate generic alternatives. We have documented transfers to offshore accounts designed to hide illegal profits." Victoria's hands began to shake. "You can't use those recordings. I never consented to being recorded. Your lawyers will advise you that consent is not required for recordings made during the commission of federal crimes," Morrison interrupted. Agent Washington was operating under proper federal authority. Every conversation, every transaction, every conspiratorial meeting has been legally documented. The scope of what they had uncovered began to dawn on Victoria. This wasn't just about her behavior tonight. It was about years of criminal activity that she had assumed was safely hidden behind corporate secrecy and regulatory capture. "We know about the price manipulation of insulin," Agent Washington continued, her voice steady but with an undertone of controlled anger. "Medications that cost $12 to produce, sold for $300 to diabetic patients. We know about the coordinated effort to delay generic alternatives. We know about the deaths." "Deaths?" Victoria's voice cracked. 437 documented cases of patients who died because they couldn't afford medications your company deliberately overpriced, Morrison said. Rationing insulin, skipping cancer treatments, elderly patients choosing between medication and food. The weight of those numbers settled over the room like a shroud. Victoria had always thought of her company's pricing strategies in abstract terms: profit margins, market positioning, shareholder value. The human cost had been an inconvenient abstraction, easily ignored from her Manhattan penthouse. "Your company's internal emails refer to these patients as acceptable losses," Agent Washington said, sliding a document across the table. "Your signature is on the memo approving those exact words." Victoria stared at the document, her own handwriting condemning her. She remembered signing it and remembered the board meeting where they had discussed the unfortunate but necessary costs of maintaining market leadership. "Tonight's assault was just the final piece of evidence we needed," Morrison explained. "It demonstrates the character and mindset behind these corporate decisions. The same contempt for human dignity that allowed you to humiliate a service worker is what allowed you to sentence hundreds of people to death for profit." The federal agents had built their case methodically, piece by piece, using Victoria's own arrogance against her. Every racist comment, every display of entitlement, every assumption that her wealth made her untouchable had been carefully documented. "Miss Ashworth Sterling," Agent Washington said, standing to her full height, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Tonight's assault charges are now the least of your concerns." As the handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists, she finally understood the magnitude of her mistake. The woman she had dismissed as worthless had been the architect of her destruction. The federal government she thought she controlled had been building an unassailable case against her, and the empire she thought was untouchable was about to crumble into dust. The news of Victoria Ashworth Sterling's arrest exploded across financial networks within hours, but the full scope of the FBI investigation wouldn't become clear until the following morning, when federal agents executed simultaneous raids across 3 states. At exactly 6 a.m., teams of agents descended on Ashworth Sterling Pharmaceuticals' Manhattan headquarters, their New Jersey manufacturing facility, and executive homes in the Hamptons. The coordinated operation had been planned for months, waiting only for the final pieces of evidence that Victoria's public meltdown had provided. Agent Washington stood in the lobby of the pharmaceutical company's gleaming 40-story tower, watching as boxes of evidence were wheeled out by forensic accountants. 18 months of undercover work had led to this moment, and the magnitude of what they had uncovered was staggering even by FBI standards. The wiretaps from the restaurant conversations alone constitute over 200 hours of recorded conspiracy, Assistant Director Morrison explained to the assembled media outside the building. "We have documented evidence of a criminal enterprise that spans the entire pharmaceutical industry." The scene outside Ashworth Sterling headquarters resembled a war zone. News trucks lined Park Avenue as reporters jostled for position, their cameras capturing federal agents emerging with box after box of evidence. The company's stock price, displayed on financial networks' rolling tickers, plummeted in real time as investors fled what was rapidly becoming the most toxic brand in corporate America. Inside the executive conference room where Victoria had held her weekly board meetings, FBI forensic specialists were meticulously cataloging documents that painted a picture of systematic corporate sociopathy, price manipulation schemes that had been refined over decades, market coordination agreements that violated every principle of free competition, and at the center of it all, Victoria's personal involvement in decisions that had cost hundreds of lives. "Look at this," Agent Rodriguez called out, holding up a printed email chain. "They have a spreadsheet calculating the exact number of patient deaths they could afford before facing significant regulatory scrutiny." The document was chilling in its clinical detachment. Columns of numbers reduce human suffering to acceptable cost-benefit ratios. Victoria's personal comments in the margins revealed a complete absence of empathy. "Diabetic compliance rates suggest we can push insulin pricing another 15% before seeing significant mortality impact." Agent Washington reviewed the evidence with the methodical precision that had made her one of the Bureau's most effective financial crimes investigators. Every conversation she had recorded at Le Bernardin was being cross-referenced with internal company documents, creating an unassailable case of premeditated conspiracy. "The Cayman Islands accounts contain over $800 million in illegal profits," forensic accountant Jennifer Kim reported. "All transferred through a network of shell companies designed to hide the money trail, but they kept meticulous records, probably for tax purposes, ironically." The irony was particularly bitter. Victoria's team of expensive lawyers and accountants had advised her to maintain detailed documentation to protect against potential civil lawsuits, never imagining those same records would become the foundation of a federal criminal case. Every memo, every email, every financial transfer had been preserved with corporate thoroughness that would now ensure her conviction. In the company's executive suite, agents discovered a safe behind a Monet painting that contained even more damaging evidence. USB drives labeled competitive intelligence contained hacked information from rival pharmaceutical companies. Files marked regulatory capture detailed bribes paid to FDA officials. Most damning of all was a folder titled Acceptable Losses that contained actuarial tables calculating the precise number of patient deaths that wouldn't trigger significant media attention. Agent Washington examined these documents with personal as well as professional interest. Each calculated death represented someone's brother, mother, child, real people who had died because medications that cost pennies to produce were priced beyond their reach. Meanwhile, in a federal holding facility in Lower Manhattan, Victoria was experiencing a complete psychological collapse. The woman who had wielded her wealth like a weapon was discovering that federal charges stripped away every privilege she had assumed was permanent. Her attorney, Marcus Kellerman of Kellerman, Barnes & Associates, Manhattan's most expensive criminal defense firm, sat across from her in the sterile consultation room, his usually confident demeanor notably subdued. The cream of New York's legal establishment, Kellerman had built his career defending white-collar criminals, but the evidence against Victoria was unlike anything he had encountered. "Victoria, I need you to understand the gravity of your situation," Kellerman said, spreading federal sentencing guidelines across the metal table. "The charges against you carry a maximum penalty of 45 years in federal prison. The assault charges are irrelevant compared to the financial crimes." 45 years? Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "That's impossible. I'm 45 years old. You're talking about a life sentence. The federal government has recorded conversations of you personally approving price increases that resulted in documented deaths," Kellerman continued. "They have financial records proving you personally profited from those decisions. They have witness testimony from patients' families. This isn't a white-collar case anymore. They're treating it as negligent homicide." The transformation in Victoria was dramatic and complete. The imperious pharmaceutical heiress had been replaced by a frightened woman facing the destruction of everything she had ever known. Her company's stock had lost 90% of its value overnight. Her personal assets had been frozen pending federal forfeiture proceedings. Her social circle had evaporated as former friends distanced themselves from the toxic scandal. The media coverage was relentless and uniformly damaging. CNN ran a special investigation titled The Price of Greed that featured interviews with families destroyed by Ashworth Sterling's pricing policies. Fox Business analyzed the financial fraud with forensic detail. Even international media covered the story as evidence of American corporate corruption run amok. "There's something else," Kellerman said, his voice careful and measured. "The FBI agent you assaulted, Agent Washington, she's not just any federal investigator. She lost her younger brother to complications from diabetes 3 years ago. He couldn't afford the insulin your company produces." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She stared at her lawyer in disbelief, the implications slowly penetrating her shock. "That's why she targeted me. This whole investigation, it's personal." "It started as a routine financial crimes investigation," Kellerman corrected. "But Agent Washington volunteered for the undercover assignment after learning about your company's pricing policies. She's been working this case with the kind of dedication that comes from personal loss." Victoria finally understood the true scope of what had happened to her. She hadn't just been caught by random federal surveillance. She had been systematically hunted by someone with both professional expertise and personal motivation. Every racist comment, every display of privilege, every moment of cruelty had been witnessed by someone whose family had been destroyed by Victoria's corporate decisions. The realization that her victim had been someone directly harmed by her business practices added a layer of poetic justice that made the case even more compelling to prosecutors and devastating to her defense. The woman she had dismissed as worthless had lost her brother to the very crimes Victoria was now facing charges for committing. Back at FBI headquarters, Agent Washington was briefing federal prosecutors on the evidence they had gathered. The conference room was filled with representatives from the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Health and Human Services. The case had grown beyond simple financial crimes into a multi-agency investigation of corporate homicide. The recorded conversations establish a clear pattern of deliberate price manipulation, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Carter explained to the assembled team. But more importantly, they demonstrate consciousness of guilt. Victoria Ashworth Sterling and her co-conspirators knew their actions would result in deaths, and they proceeded anyway. Agent Washington pulled up a recorded conversation from 3 months earlier when Victoria had been dining with executives from 2 competing pharmaceutical companies. Her voice filled the conference room. "Diabetic patients are a captive market. They'll pay whatever we charge because the alternative is death. We're not selling medication, we're selling life itself." The callousness of the statement was breathtaking even to seasoned federal prosecutors who had seen decades of corporate criminality. This wasn't negligent oversight or regulatory compliance failure. It was deliberate exploitation of human desperation for profit. "The victim impact statements are particularly compelling," Prosecutor Carter continued. "We have identified over 400 families who lost members directly due to Ashworth Sterling's pricing policies. Parents who rationed their children's insulin, cancer patients who skipped treatments, elderly people who died because they chose food over medication." Agent Washington had spent months collecting these stories, interviewing families who had been destroyed by corporate greed. Each case had been carefully documented, each death verified as directly attributable to medication pricing that deliberately exceeded what patients could afford. The human cost of Victoria's business decisions was staggering in its scope and devastating in its specificity. Maria Santos, 43, mother of 2, who died from diabetic ketoacidosis after rationing insulin. Robert Carter, 67, who skipped cancer treatments because the medications cost more than his monthly Social Security check. Jennifer Williams, 19, a college student who died because she couldn't afford both insulin and tuition. These weren't statistics to Agent Washington. They were names and faces she had memorized during months of investigation. Each death certificate she had reviewed, each grieving family she had interviewed, had strengthened her resolve to see justice done. The psychological evaluation of the defendant is also revealing, Agent Washington reported. Dr. Amanda Foster's assessment indicates classic narcissistic personality disorder with sociopathic traits. Complete absence of empathy for victims, grandiose sense of entitlement, and inability to accept responsibility for consequences. The federal case was unprecedented in its scope and ironclad in its evidence. Months of undercover work had produced hundreds of hours of recorded conspiracies. Financial forensics had uncovered billions in illegal transfers. Victim impact documentation had established direct causation between corporate decisions and human deaths. But perhaps most damaging of all was Victoria's own behavior during the assault. The racist language, the public humiliation, the casual cruelty, all captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by Manhattan's elite. It painted a picture of someone capable of viewing other human beings as fundamentally inferior and disposable. The defendant's assault on Agent Washington demonstrates the same mindset that enabled the pricing conspiracy, Prosecutor Carter explained. Someone who could publicly humiliate and physically attack a service worker based on racial prejudice is someone who could sentence hundreds of patients to death for profit. As news of the federal investigation spread, other pharmaceutical companies began conducting internal reviews, terrified that their own pricing practices might come under scrutiny. The industry that had operated with impunity for decades suddenly faced the prospect of federal prosecution for what they had always considered standard business practices. Victoria's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was taking the entire corrupt system down with it, and at the center of it all stood Agent Gabrielle Washington, the woman Victoria had dismissed as worthless, proving that justice could come from the most unexpected places. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had become the epicenter of what legal experts were calling the most significant corporate criminal trial of the century. Victoria Ashworth Sterling sat at the defendant's table, a shadow of her former self, as Judge Patricia Morrison prepared to deliver a sentence that would redefine corporate accountability in America. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Victims' families filled the gallery, many holding photographs of loved ones who had died because they couldn't afford medications that Ashworth Sterling Pharmaceuticals had deliberately overpriced. Media representatives from around the world documented every moment of what had become a landmark case in corporate justice. Miss Ashworth Sterling, Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of months of testimony. In my 30 years on the federal bench, I have never encountered a case that so clearly demonstrates the devastating human cost of corporate greed. Victoria's guilty plea had come after weeks of overwhelming evidence presentation. The recorded conversations, the internal documents, the financial records, all had painted an inescapable picture of systematic criminal conspiracy. Her legal team's attempts to negotiate a plea bargain had been rejected by prosecutors who insisted that the scope of the crimes demanded maximum accountability. Agent Washington sat in the front row, her testimony having been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. When she had taken the stand 3 weeks earlier to describe losing her brother Marcus to diabetic complications he couldn't afford to treat, there hadn't been a dry eye in the courtroom. "My brother was 24 years old," she had testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "He was a graduate student, working part-time to pay for school. When his insurance was cut, he tried to ration his insulin to make it last longer. The defendant's company had raised the price by 300% in 2 years, making it impossible for someone like Marcus to afford. The moment had been devastating to Victoria's defense. Here was the federal agent she had assaulted, revealing that the crimes Victoria was charged with had directly killed someone she loved. The personal dimension added emotional weight that transformed abstract financial crimes into tangible human tragedy. The evidence presented in this case, Judge Morrison continued, establishes that Miss Ashworth Sterling personally approved pricing decisions that she knew would result in patient deaths. Internal company documents refer to these deaths as acceptable losses in pursuit of increased profit margins. The financial scope of the crimes was staggering. Federal prosecutors had proven that Ashworth Sterling Pharmaceuticals had generated over $2.8 billion in illegal profits through price manipulation and market coordination. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands had contained nearly $1 billion in laundered money, all traced directly to the pharmaceutical pricing conspiracy. This court sentences Victoria Ashworth Sterling to 12 years in federal prison, Judge Morrison announced, her words echoing through the packed courtroom. Additionally, the defendant is ordered to pay $500 million in criminal fines and $2.3 billion in restitution to affected patients and their families. The sentence was met with a mixture of applause and tears from the victims' families. For many, no punishment could restore their lost loved ones, but the acknowledgement of Victoria's crimes provided a sense of justice that had seemed impossible just months earlier. But the consequences extended far beyond Victoria's personal fate. Ashworth Sterling Pharmaceuticals had been dissolved as part of the criminal forfeiture proceedings, its assets liquidated to fund victim compensation. The company's executives faced their own federal charges, with several already pleading guilty to avoid lengthy trials. The regulatory response was swift and comprehensive. Congress passed emergency legislation mandating transparency in pharmaceutical pricing and establishing federal oversight of medication accessibility. The FDA implemented new rules requiring companies to justify price increases above certain thresholds. Most significantly, a new federal task force was created specifically to investigate corporate pricing practices that endangered public health. Agent Washington had been promoted to lead this new financial crimes and public health unit, her work on the Ashworth Sterling case establishing her as the federal government's premier expert on pharmaceutical corruption. The case had become a template for investigating corporate crimes that caused human suffering. Today's sentence sends a clear message, U.S. Attorney Sarah Carter announced outside the courthouse. Corporate executives who treat human life as a commodity to be exploited for profit will face the full weight of federal prosecution. The days of treating patient deaths as acceptable business costs are over. Victoria was led away in handcuffs, her pharmaceutical empire reduced to rubble, her personal fortune confiscated, her freedom stripped away for the next 12 years. The woman who had once wielded absolute power over life and death decisions for thousands of patients would spend her remaining productive years in federal prison. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the system that had enabled such cruelty had been fundamentally reformed. Today, 3 years after that fateful evening at Le Bernardin, Agent Gabrielle Washington continues her work as director of the FBI's Financial Crimes and Public Health Division. The unit she helped create has investigated over 40 pharmaceutical companies, resulting in billions in fines and fundamental changes to how medications are priced in America. The restaurant where Victoria's racist assault was captured on camera has become an unlikely symbol of justice. Le Bernardin now hosts an annual fundraiser for diabetes research, with proceeds going to provide free insulin for patients who cannot afford their medications. The table where Victoria sat that night bears a small plaque commemorating those who died because health care was treated as a privilege rather than a right. Victoria Ashworth Sterling remains in federal prison, serving her 12-year sentence. Her former empire has been completely dismantled, with $2.3 billion in restitution providing life-saving medications to over 100,000 patients who otherwise couldn't afford treatment. Her personal assets were auctioned to fund victim compensation programs. The case sparked a national conversation about corporate accountability and racial justice that continues to resonate. The viral video of Victoria's racist assault, followed by the revelation of Agent Washington's true identity, became a powerful symbol of how assumptions about race and class can blind people to reality. People saw a wealthy white woman attacking a black service worker and assumed they understood the power dynamic, Agent Washington reflects. But justice doesn't always come from the places we expect. Sometimes the person you dismiss as powerless is exactly the person with the authority to hold you accountable. The pharmaceutical industry has been transformed by regulatory changes that followed Victoria's conviction. Medication pricing transparency is now mandatory. Federal oversight prevents market manipulation. New competition policies have reduced insulin prices by 80% from their peak during Victoria's reign. Agent Washington keeps a photo on her desk of her brother Marcus at his college graduation. He wanted to be a teacher, she says. He believed everyone deserved access to education, to opportunity, to the chance to build a better life. The work we do now honors that belief. The Financial Crimes and Public Health Division has become one of the FBI's fastest-growing units, investigating cases where corporate malfeasance directly endangers human life. The model established by the Ashworth Sterling investigation has been applied to cases involving contaminated food, unsafe medical devices, and environmental crimes. For families who lost loved ones to pharmaceutical price manipulation, Victoria's imprisonment provides some measure of closure. But the real victory lies in systemic changes ensuring other families won't face impossible choices between medication and financial survival. The story serves as a reminder that justice can emerge from unexpected places, carried out by people whose power isn't always visible. It proves that even in a system often tilted toward wealth and privilege, dedicated individuals can still hold the powerful accountable. Victoria's assault on Agent Washington that night revealed more than just personal racism. It exposed the same mindset that allowed her to treat patient deaths as acceptable business costs. The woman she dismissed as worthless became the architect of justice for hundreds of victims. What assumptions do we make about people based on their appearance? How often do we underestimate those around us? Share your thoughts about times when you've seen someone completely misjudge another person's capabilities. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, share it with others who believe in accountability, and subscribe for more stories where justice prevails over privilege.
At Black Voices Uncut, we don't polish away the pain or water down the message. We tell it like it is because the truth deserves nothing less. If today's story spoke to you, click like, join the conversation in the comments, and subscribe so you'll be here for the next Uncut Voice.